Come along on a captivating historical adventure as we solve the mystery behind the fall of the Soviet Union, one of the most momentous events of the 20th century. But how did a world powerhouse fall apart so quickly, leaving a wake of dashed hopes and unstable geopolitics behind? Get ready to learn the little-known facts and unseen tales that contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. What factors brought this once powerful country to its demise? And what lessons can we draw from it? Prepare to investigate the murky truth behind the demise of a superpower and the establishment of a new international order. The element of politics. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. His main domestic objectives were to revive the stagnant Soviet economy and reduce the burdensome government bureaucracy. After his first reform attempts produced little to no effect, he implemented the openness and restructuring programs of glasnost and perestroika. While the latter introduced quasi-free market rules to government-run enterprises, the former was meant to promote discourse. Instead of bringing communist ideas back to life, glasnost allowed criticism of the entire Soviet system to flourish. The public sphere and the media came under state control, while democratic reform movements gained momentum across the Soviet bloc. Price controls were loosened in some markets during perestroika, but bureaucratic frameworks remained in place, allowing communist officials to rebel against measures that did not directly benefit them. This was the worst aspect of both capitalism and communism. Gorbachev's reforms and rejection of the Brezhnev doctrine ultimately accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union. By the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Solidarity had taken control in Poland. The Baltic states were making significant progress toward freedom, and Hungary had taken down its border fence with Austria. The Soviet Union would not continue long after the breakdown of the Iron Curtain. The financial aspect. Although the Soviet economy was, by some estimates, the second largest in the world in 1990, hoarding and frequent shortages of consumer goods were prevalent. The black market economy in the Soviet Union was thought to be worth more than 10% of the official GDP of the nation. The country had been crippled by economic stagnation for years, and the perestroika reforms had made matters worse. Printing money was used to fund wage increases, which fueled an inflationary spiral. A severe decline in the price of oil plunged the Soviet economy into collapse, and mishandled budgetary policy left the nation open to outside influences. The Soviet Union was one of the leading producers of energy resources in the world during the 1970s and 1980s, including natural gas and oil, and its exports of these goods were essential in supporting the greatest command economy in history. This essential lifeline to outside funding disappeared in March 1986, as oil fell from $120 per barrel in 1980 to $24 per barrel. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, the price of oil briefly surged, although the Soviet Union's fall was already well underway at that moment. The role of the military. It is a commonly held view that the Soviet Union's defense spending surged considerably in reaction to ideas like the Strategic Defense Initiative and the presidency of Ronald Reagan. In actuality, the Soviet military budget had been rising since at least the early 1970s, although the precise figures remained unknown to Western experts. Outside estimates of Soviet military spending varied from 10 to 20% of GDP, and even within the Soviet Union itself, precise accounting was challenging due to the involvement of multiple government ministries, each with opposing interests in the military budget. Nevertheless, one thing that can be claimed with certainty is that military spending was always well-funded, regardless of general economic trends. This was the case even when the Soviet economy faltered. Furthermore, when it came to talent for research and development, the military was given preference. Instead of supporting Gorbachev's partial shift to a market economy, technological inventors and aspiring entrepreneurs were directed onto the defense sector. Afghanistan. Apart from financial concerns, the Soviet Union's participation in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 had a crucial military role in the disintegration of the USSR. The Soviet Army had entered a maze in an area known as the Graveyard of Empires. It was heralded for its involvement in World War II and for being a crucial instrument in the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution and Prague Spring. Up to 1 million Soviet soldiers took part in the 10-year occupation. Thousands more were injured, and about 15,000 were murdered. At least 4 million Afghans were internally displaced by the fighting, and over 1 million Afghans, mostly civilians, were killed. With American surface-to-air missiles at their disposal, the Mujahideen frustrated the army that had defeated Hitler and put an end to dissent during the Cold War. Dissent on the war in Afghanistan remained muffled as long as the government controlled the press. But glasnost allowed the vocalization of widespread war fatigue. The army, which was arguably the strongest opponent of Gorbachev's reform initiatives, was caught off guard by the impasse in Afghanistan and lost any potential influence. It may have had to slow down the perestroika's progress. The Afghansi, or veterans of the Afghan War, rebelled against what they saw to be Moscow's war in the Soviet republics. There were numerous demonstrations, since many servicemen from the Central Asian republics felt more affinity for Afghans than Russians did on an ethnic and religious level. Even more pronounced was the split with Moscow among the European republics. Protests against the war broke out in Ukraine, and opposition groups in the Baltic republics interpreted the Afghan conflict through the prism of Russia's annexation of their own nations. This fed the separatist movements that ultimately to the three Baltic states' mostly unchecked 1990 declarations of independence. The social component. The first McDonald's restaurant opened its doors in Moscow on January 31, 1990. There were lines forming around the block to try the Big Mac for the first time, and the golden arches in Pushkin Square appeared to be a symbol of the success of Western capitalism. However, during the last years of the Soviet Union, such a spectacle was not unusual. Moscow residents waited in line for liberal publications' morning editions for the same amount of time. Indeed, the advent of glasnost had brought with it a plethora of new concepts, ideas, and experiences, and the people of the Soviet Union were keen to investigate them. Whether it was by reading democratization-related articles written by prominent political philosophers or taking a taste of Western-style fast food as a way to get a taste of a market economy. Everything is rotten. Eduard Shevardnadze had informed Mikhail Gorbachev in 1984. It needs to be modified. It was not an unusual feeling. The pervasive corruption that pervaded the Soviet state infuriated the people of the Soviet Union. With glasnost and perestroika, Gorbachev aimed to create a new agreement between the Soviet people and the government, essentially transforming the Soviet character. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's principal advisor, outlined the difficulties they faced, saying, "The main issue today is not only economy, just the material portion of the process is covered here. The political structure and how it interacts with humans are at the center of the issue." In the end, a last-ditch coup attempt by communist hardliners destroyed the Soviet Union, because the strain between the newly empowered citizens and a Soviet state with damaged credibility was too great to overcome. The element of nuclear. The Soviet Union and the United States lived on the brink of nuclear war throughout the Cold War. But few had imagined that a crisis involving a civilian nuclear power facility would bring down the Soviet Union. On April 26, 1986, the Unit 4 reactor at the Chernobyl power station in Pripyat erupted, ending Gorbachev's almost year-long rule. More than 400 times as much radioactive fallout was emitted by the explosion and the ensuing fires than by the atomic bomb fired on Hiroshima. Gorbachev's openness policy would be put to the test in the official response to the catastrophe, and glasnost would come up short in that regard. Chinese Communist Party authorities moved swiftly to stifle information about how serious the accident was. They even ordered May Day parades and celebrations in the affected area to go ahead as scheduled, even though there was a recognized risk of radioactive exposure. Reports from the West on the extremely high amounts of radioactivity carried by the wind were written off as rumors, and Geiger counters were discreetly taken out of science classrooms by apparatus collectors. On May 4, workers were ultimately able to contain the radiation leak, but it took Gorbachev 18 days, or until May 14, to make an official declaration to the public. He denounced the Western media's coverage of the Chernobyl disaster as a highly immoral campaign of malicious lies and called the event a misfortune. The daily realities of persons in the contamination zone who were suffering from the physical impacts of radiation illness began to diverge from Communist Party rhetoric over time. Any remaining faith in the Soviet system had been destroyed. Even more than my launch of perestroika was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later, declared Gorbachev on the anniversary of the accident, which occurred decades later. Curious to understand the secrets behind the Soviet Union's collapse? Subscribe now to dive deeper into the riveting tale of how a superpower met its demise.